Hello, I'm Robert Royal, and these are the Catholic Thing podcasts. We're coming to you today. It's Monday, December 18, 2023, sort of in an unplanned session because many of us in North America woke up this morning to find out that the Vatican has issued a document, an elaborate document that we're going to try to sort out in this session, that essentially makes it possible and says in a formal declaration from the Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith that under certain circumstances, even same sex couples can be blessed. I think it's not incorrect to put it that way. And to help us in this conversation, we have a familiar face, Father Gerald Murray, who is a canon lawyer. He has been a longtime colleague of mine with the Papal Posse on EWTN, and he's a pastor of a parish in Manhattan, in New York. So, Father Murray, it's great to have you with us again today. And we know you're a busy man because you are the go-to source when things like this happen in Rome. So we were glad to be able to get you on so quickly.
No, great.
Before we get in, I wish we didn't have to be here, but frankly, we do. And I'm sure our viewers and our listeners are going to be very interested in this particular session of the Catholic Thing. Before we get into the specifics and some of the technicalities, though, I'd like to just ask you, because you're a pastor as well as being a learned canon lawyer and an observer of the Vatican, what do you think is going to be the reaction among your people? Maybe you've already been even hearing from them. And what is it likely to be the reaction, not only in the church, but in the world as a whole, to this somewhat convoluted and difficult to, I have to say, frankly, I'm still kind of mystified that this came out on a Monday morning. But, just like in general terms, let's start there.
Sure. No, I think the general reaction, which is already being seen in the media, is that people are surprised that the Catholic Church is teaching that homosexual unions are now deserving of God's blessing. Because everyone understands the church blesses something that it considers to be able to receive a blessing. That's why we bless marriages. That's why we bless wedding, engagement rings, because an engagement's a relationship that's going to lead to marriage. We bless all kinds of sports teams, So basically, the message given is what the Catholic Church has condemned in the past as being mortally sinful is now they're encouraging priests to bless those relationships. So I think most priests, I think they're horrified by this. This is a contradiction of what came in the past. For the world is pleasantly surprised because, the modern liberal social order has totally endorsed the homosexual agenda. But I think places that we call the third world, Africa, Latin America, Asia, I'm sure the bishops there are just stunned because when the missionaries came, they taught the catechism. They didn't teach the secular agenda. And now the Vatican's endorsed the secular agenda.
Yeah. Let me read a passage that comes early in this document, because clearly some of the points that you just made are in this document, that the church blesses some things that just sort of casually the pious practices, much of which, frankly, seems to me to be a smokescreen for the other things that are kind of concealed within the way that the discourse goes. But here's the way it starts. And it's a formal declaration, it's capital D declaration, which, as I understand it, is the highest level authority a document can have coming out from a dicastery like the Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith. And Cardinal Fernandez explains that their Congreso, their learned experts, their theologians worked on this. He had conversations with the Holy Father about it, and that this document has the approval of the Pope. And then there's this. I want to read this. This is from paragraph 2 in the document. The value of this document, however, is that it offers a specific and innovative contribution to the pastoral meeting of blessings, permitting a broadening and enrichment of the classical understanding of blessings, which is closely linked to liturgical perspective. Such theological reflection based on the pastoral vision of Pope Francis implies a real development from what has been said about blessings in the magisterium and the official text of the church. This explains why this text takes on the typology of declaration. Now, look, as we know, developments do take place in the church, and I always tell people who ask me about this, no one answers a question until it gets asked. So when people began to ask questions, who is Jesus? Is he divine? Is he simply divine? Is he simply, you develop these principles. But they seem to be kind of invoking the spirit of John Henry Newman, the great theorist of true development versus corruptions in the church. And yes, of course, you can bless other things, as you were saying earlier, but is this an enrichment? Is this, the idea of blessing? We know there are other instances, but specifically with regard to these same-sex couples who come forth for blessings, could we truly call this a development?
No, that's a misuse of the word development. And it's accurate to call it innovative because it's an innovation, meaning it's something new that hasn't happened before. And the reason it hasn't happened before is it's a contradiction of the church's teaching. A development, as you point out, Cardinal Newman was eloquent about this, a thing becomes more fully itself. As an acorn becomes a tree over time with nourishment and sunlight, likewise, the understanding of the church, for instance, on the papacy, the Holy Eucharist, the other sacraments, it develops over time because, as you say, until someone asks a question, an answer is basically implicit, not explicit. So to make explicit what a thing is not to change its nature or to corrupt it. And the major problem with this document is its casuistry, false casuistry. Casuistry is basically a deceptive and unfair use of revelation to try and arrive at a predetermined conclusion. And this basically says there's a difference between a liturgical blessing and a non-liturgical blessing.
Right.
This is ridiculous. Every blessing in the church, it comes from the fact that God blessed us in Jesus Christ. And we primarily in the church, as a hierarchical organization, bring those blessings through public ministries. So to say there's something that's like an unofficial blessing, they compare it to a parent blessing his children, at the dinner table. But wait a minute. This has nothing to do with a mom and a dad saying, I bless you, Tommy, I bless you, Sally. This is a relationship. And what is the subject of the relationship? That's really what we have to get down. It's not really persons in the end. Because, for instance, when the Pope gets in the Pope Mobile and blesses everyone as going through St. Peter's Square, he doesn't ask questions, what's your state of soul? Because he's blessing them as individuals. When two people come forward and say, we just got married at City Hall, two men, and we like to bless our relationship. Well, what's the relationship? It's a promise to commit immoral acts. Same with people in a second adulterous marriage. We're going to commit adultery, even though our former wife or husband, is still living in the same town. So it's a dodge to say we bless people without asking questions, therefore we shouldn't ask questions. Next time two people who are involved in an incestuous relationship come in and say, Father, would you bless us? We're brother and sister, but we think sex is beyond the strictures that used to be. Is the priest supposed to say, well, if you feel it's important, maybe I should bless you? Of course not. Everybody would know that's endorsing incest.
Yeah, listen, the interesting thing to me, terribly interesting, is that they say at several points that, of course, the church cannot bless what is sinful. It can only bless to try to elevate people to come closer to God. But there's also this, and you just brought this up about this distinction between liturgical blessings and what they call sort of pious practices, which are kind of informal. Let me just read this passage because I think it's worth having the actual words before us. One must also avoid the risk of reducing the meaning of blessings to this point of view alone, in other words, liturgical, so it's like a sacrament. For it would lead us to expect the same moral conditions for a simple blessing that are called for in the reception of the sacraments. Such a risk requires that we broaden this perspective further. Indeed, there is a danger that a pastoral gesture that is so beloved and widespread, and I mean, like there are all kinds of things, people bless boats going out to fish and whatnot. All right, that's widespread and pastoral, but they're not applying it to that, of course, in this circumstance. So beloved and widespread will be subjected to too many moral prerequisites which under the claim of control could overshadow the unconditional power of God's love that forms the basis for the gesture of blessing. Is this a realistic way to describe what obviously is going to be the most important part, because nobody's going to care if you're blessing pets or the other things that we've talked about casually?
Well, let's just ask a question. Is the divine law an expression of God's love? When the Lord asks people in the course of his miracle performing, he has to ask the woman at the well, call your husband. I mean, the Lord is interested in the moral status of our souls, because guess what? This life is not the whole story. We die, the soul goes before God for judgment. So, yeah, what this is doing is basically saying mortal sin is not a big deal, so don't ask too many questions. But wait a minute. The people who are engaged in a same-sex union that involves sodomy, they're coming to the priest to be affirmed that the church is okay with this. Because if they didn't care, they wouldn't be there. And they believe it's an analogy to marriage. So if you go ahead and say, yeah, we're going to bless you, but we're not going to call it a liturgy, and we can't, have you seen the part in the document that says people seeking these blessings shouldn't be dressed in wedding clothes? And it shouldn't be done the same moment as they get their civil union at City Hall. This is absurd. Bob, this distinction here between a liturgical and a pious blessing, it's an irrelevant question. The question is, what is the essential thing that the priest is now being asked to do, which is he's asked to say, we believe God will favor your behavior, and therefore we're going to ask him. And as a minister of the church, I'm asking in my capacity as a priest to bless your relationship. And why do people want a blessing? They want reassurance that God is not opposed to their behavior. In fact, that God is willing to favor it. So if the church gives the misimpression that sodomy is no longer a big deal, then, of course, blessings, that's just a minor detail. The real question that they want to know is, am I doing something wrong if I engage in sodomy? And the answer is, now, if you can get a blessing, really? The church? How can you think of this, Bob? I'm a priest. Two men come in and say, Father, we just got married at City Hall. We'd like you to bless our behavior. And I say, well, the church teaches that mortal sin has to be repented, has to be a firm purpose of amendment. You can't continue to practice sodomy. And then the couple say, well, wait a minute. The Pope just told you that you can bless us and don't ask too many questions. And then the answer is the Pope got it wrong. And that's really the saddest part. Well, one of the sad parts of this. The teaching itself is now being questioned, and the questioning is happening by the Pope.
Yeah, I kept waiting as I was reading the document for the place where, at least minimally, the person who is going to be offering the blessing, probably a priest or a deacon, asks just one question. Are you coming here for a blessing because you want to lead a more fully Christian life, or are you looking for an affirmation of your behavior? And that's nowhere here. There are multiple attempts to say, oh, we can't confuse this. There should not be an exchanging rings. People should not be wearing wedding garments. But we know that in the Anglican Church, that's precisely what's happened. They still can't marry same-sex couples in the church, but they can do blessings on the altar. And it has the full trappings of what you normally think of as a wedding, and people go off and they have a wedding banquet type thing afterward. I don't believe that these limitations and these attempts to kind of qualify what this blessing is going to be are going to hold very long, because we know that even within the church, sad to say, there are priests, bishops, even cardinals who've been pushing in that direction. I want to ask you one last question, because we're kind of running out of time now. Again, to stick to the text, just so that we can know exactly what is being said. About midway through, it says, thus, when people ask for a blessing, an exhaustive moral analysis should not be placed as a precondition for conferring it. For those seeking a blessing should not be required to have prior moral perfection. Okay, we understand what that means. But not having prior moral perfection, none of us have prior moral perfection, doesn't say that we can't ask some questions about exactly what we were just talking about. And the document goes on to say that look, and some people have said, well, this means this is only going to be spontaneous. That dioceses, bishops' conferences should not set up formal rituals for these types of blessings. So they're trying to make sure that this does not, I don't know, enter into liturgical books with a proper rite for same-sex marriages or trans, whatever these things that they're going to try to put into place are going to be. But even if these began as simply spontaneous, what is this going to do to our church? I remember when the Holy Father said, who am I to judge, on the flight back from Brazil way back when. My daughter was in college at the time, came home and said, Dad, did you hear that the Holy Father said that being gay is okay? That's the kind of immediate transmission belt that exists in our society these days. So can we avoid they're at great pains to say, avoid confusion of this with marriage. Marriage is only what traditionally has been taught. But can that possibly be a realistic thing? Do they really believe that over in Rome?
Well, the issue is not that people are confusing it with marriage, because it's obvious two men can't marry each other. The Catholic Church is not the only institution in the world that has taught that in the history of the world. The question is, does the Catholic Church consider sodomy and adultery to be mortal sins? And when you have a mortal sin, you don't come to the priest and say, I'm committing this sin now and will continue to do it, but I'd like you to bless me and the person with whom I habitually commit this sin, because that we think that this is an important thing in our life. The church would say, the most important thing in your life is not what you consider to be valuable when it contradicts revelation. So what you have to do is have a firm purpose of amendment, remove yourself from the occasion of sin, and live a virtuous life. Then we'll happily bless you. But we're not going to bless the relationship that's leading you on the road to hell. And this really, for me, is one of the most shocking things about this. All of this casuitical reasoning, it's unofficial blessing. You can't dress up in your wedding garments. You has to be don't use a ritual. I say to myself, well, what's the priest supposed to do who's going to do this? Write his own ritual? What are his sources going to be? He's going to take it from the Bible, and you can take it from the liturgy. By the way, is he forbidden to give a sign of the cross? Because most blessings include that. This is casuistry on the very people who condemn true moral reasoning as being casuistry. So for me, the scandal here is that the Pope, Cardinal Fernandez, and all those who agree with him, they are telling people who are engaging in sodomy and adultery, no problem. The church agrees that your behavior, while not up to perfection, is something that we can bless. This is unreal. And as I said earlier, I was thinking about it. Let's say there are Catholics who are polygamists, which certainly has been the case in Africa. Lots of polygamy, and people have joined the church. Can they walk in now with the 5 wives and say, look, I know it's not the ideal, but if the homosexual people get blessed, why can't I? And they say, well, we'll do it, but it doesn't mean you endorse your behavior. What planet do they live on? Is this possible, Bob? That I'll leave it at that.
Yeah. Well, listen, at the very end of the document, they say, don't expect any further commentary on this subject matter. So I think that they think that now it's closed. They've put it out there, and other people are going to deal with this. We'll let bishops try to discipline their priests, or whatever is going to happen as a result of this document coming out. But we don't have any more time today to discuss this, but we will be back, I'm sure, Father, with you as this subject matter begins to develop further. And I think it's going to happen very, very quickly in the next weeks and months anyway. So thanks again to Father Gerald Murray for joining us from New York. Thank you all for listening or watching, and we'll see you next time at the Catholic Thing podcast.